The bulldozer's tracks were still hot when Vanessa Kroll planted her heels in my grandfather's peat and said, "It's just dirt, Mr. Sorensen. Dead dirt. And dead dirt doesn't get a vote." That was 9:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in April. I remember the time because I was standing 40 feet away with my phone already recording, and the timestamp is burned into 3 years of my life now. Behind her, 2 excavators were peeling 3 feet of black peat off 11 acres of my family's bog like they were skinning an animal. Trucks lined up on the access road, engines idling, waiting to haul it to garden centres across the county. By lunch that day, they'd stripped enough moisture-holding peat to fill 40 semi-trailers. By the end of the week, the number was closer to 260 truckloads, peat that had been compressing, saturating, and holding water since before the Civil War. Here are the numbers that should scare every homeowner listening to this. 240 homes in Tamarack Hollow Estates, a special landscaping beautification assessment of $4,200 per household. That's just over $1 million collected in 6 weeks for a rose garden and a decorative koi pond that never got built. By the time this story ends, Vanessa Kroll will be led out of a county courthouse in handcuffs, and she will personally owe $84,000 in court-ordered restitution, money that won't even cover the foundation repair on one single house in that subdivision. Every home she and her board built their little empire on top of would crack down to the slab within 18 months. And she would never understand why, because the real weapon in this story wasn't a lawsuit or a lien or a fine. It was water. Water I had been quietly managing under that ground for 11 years before she ever set foot on it, and a piece of paper from 1911 that nobody in that boardroom had bothered to read. My name is Walter Sorensen. I'm 63 years old, and until the state let me retire 2 years ago, I spent 36 years as a licensed hydrogeologist for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, testing soil saturation and groundwater tables across 4 counties. I know what peat does. I know what happens when you take it away. And on that April morning, watching Vanessa Kroll's crew load my grandfather's bog onto flatbed trucks, I already knew, down to the month, when the first house in Tamarack Hollow was going to crack. I just didn't say anything yet. The land under my boots had a name once, though nobody outside my family ever called it that. Sorensen's Mire. My great-grandfather, Ole Sorensen, homesteaded 160 acres of it in 1911. Back when the county still measured land in rods, and the nearest doctor was an 11-mile ride by wagon. Ole wasn't a farmer by trade. He'd worked the iron docks in Duluth before his lungs gave him trouble, and a doctor told him the low country might do him good. So he bought the cheapest, wettest, most useless-looking parcel in the township, a black bog nobody else wanted, and built a 2-room house on the only dry rise for half a mile. He didn't know he'd bought a sponge. Not at first. It was his son, my grandfather, Henrik, who figured it out, that the 11 feet of compressed sphagnum peat under that bog held water like nothing else in the county, that it fed a slow, steady seep into the water table for 3 miles in every direction, keeping the soil moist even in drought years when neighboring farms turned to dust. Henrik used to say the bog was the county's canteen, and he wasn't wrong. When I was a boy in the 1960s, I watched him walk that low ground barefoot every August, checking the give underfoot, the way another man might check a barometer. My father inherited it in 1978. I inherited it from him in 2003. The same year, construction crews broke ground half a mile east of our fence line to build 240 homes on what used to be the old Peterson dairy pasture. Nobody asked me anything. Nobody needed to. My family's land wasn't part of the subdivision. It was just there. Quiet. Wet. Ours. I can still close my eyes and walk that bog from memory. The smell of it in early spring. Cold, mineral, faintly sweet, like tea steeped too long. The sound your boots make pulling out of black muck, a sound like a held breath finally let go. The tamaracks at the north edge, needles turning gold in October, dropping into water that never quite freezes solid even in a Minnesota January because the peat underneath holds heat like a slow furnace. My grandfather's hand-built cedar duck blind, grey and silvered now, still standing on the little hummock where he used to sit before dawn, with a thermos of coffee and a shotgun he never much liked using. There's a roll-top desk in my front room that Henrik built in 1931 from planks he milled himself, and in the bottom drawer, underneath 20 years of tax receipts, there's a folder of surveys, easement filings, and a hand-drawn hydrology map my father made in 1969, tracking exactly how the water moved from our bog into the aquifer that, decades later, would sit directly beneath Tamarack Hollow Estates. I'd added to that folder myself, every year for 11 years, without telling a single soul why. Vanessa Kroll didn't know any of that. She didn't know my name until the week she needed a place to dump 3 feet of unwanted peat. Vanessa was 52, HOA president for 6 years running, and she drove a white Range Rover so clean you could see your reflection in the door panel from across the street. She wore a cream-coloured blazer to board meetings like it was a uniform, always with a laminated clipboard tucked under one arm, colour-coded tabs for violations, assessments, and what she liked to call community vision initiatives. She'd been a mid-level real estate agent before Tamarack Hollow, and something about running that board had turned a small woman's ambition into something with teeth. She talked about curb appeal the way other people talk about scripture. The Rose Garden had been her idea from the start, a centerpiece for the entrance circle, something to put in the real estate listings, something that would push resale values up to maybe 3%, enough to matter to 240 homeowners all at once. She needed rich, moisture-retentive soil, fast and cheap, and she needed money to build it, money the HOA didn't have. So she found both 15 minutes from her own subdivision on 160 acres of unincorporated bog she assumed, correctly, that nobody was watching closely enough to stop her from taking. She was wrong about exactly one thing, and it would cost her everything. I didn't say a word to Vanessa Kroll that morning. I've learned over 36 years of state work that the man who talks first at a wetland violation site is usually the man who loses the case later. So I stood at the fence line with my phone in landscape mode and I filmed. 9:12 a.m., then 9:47, then 10:15, when the 4th truck pulled out loaded with peat that had taken 4,000 years to form, 3 feet of it gone in under an hour. By that evening, I had 6 hours of footage, 41 photographs with timestamps and GPS tags, and a notebook, an actual paper notebook, the kind my father used to keep, with every truck's license plate number written down in pencil. I sent myself an email with the whole file attached, timestamped, because email servers keep records even when memory cards get lost. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Tamarack Hollow Homeowners Association, certified mail, signature required. I still have the envelope. Inside was a notice of violation and assessment, $1,850, for what the letter called unmaintained wetland vegetation creating a blight condition adjacent to community boundary, in violation of Section 4.2 of the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. I read it twice standing at my own mailbox, and I laughed out loud, which probably looked strange to anyone driving by. My grandfather's bog had never been inside that HOA's boundary. It never signed on to their covenants. It was never even platted as part of Tamarack Hollow. Vanessa Kroll's board had fined 160 acres of land that legally had nothing to do with them for the crime of existing next door to a subdivision whose entrance garden they just built by stealing dirt off it. I didn't call her. I didn't write back angry. I did what I'd done for 36 years, working violations for the state. I documented, dated, and filed. I drove into town and pulled the recorded plat for Tamarack Hollow Estates at the county recorder's office, paid $4 for a certified copy, and confirmed what I already knew. My grandfather's parcel, filed in 1911 under the original homestead patent, sat entirely outside the subdivision's legal boundary, buffered by a 60-foot unincorporated right-of-way that the developer had never purchased. Then I drafted my own certified letter back to the HOA board, care of Vanessa Kroll, president. I kept it short. I informed them that the notice was void for lack of jurisdiction, that the property in question was not now nor had ever been subject to the association's declaration, and that I would be retaining all documentation regarding the unauthorized removal of soil from my land. Soil which, under Minnesota Statute 103G.245, constitutes a regulated wetland resource and cannot be excavated, drained, or removed without a permit from the Board of Water and Soil Resources. I cited the statute number because I wanted it in writing, on the record, delivered by a mail carrier who'd signed for it that she'd been told. I got my face-to-face with her 9 days later at the County Garden Expo, of all places. She was there with a booth for the HOA's Tamarack Hollow Community Beautification Project. Photos of the new rose garden blown up poster-size behind her. Roses that hadn't even bloomed yet because they'd only been in the ground 3 weeks. "Mr. Sorensen," she said, and her smile didn't move much. "I got your letter. My attorney says it's aggressive." "It's accurate," I said. "That's different." That bog was an eyesore for 40 years. Nobody was using it. We turned it into something the whole community could enjoy. It wasn't yours to turn into anything. She glanced past me at a woman inspecting a rack of hydrangeas and lowered her voice like we were sharing something private instead of standing in a public expo hall. "Look, old man, I don't know what you think you're going to do about it. That land's not worth what it costs to fight over. Let it go. Nobody's coming to save a swamp." I remember exactly what I said back because I'd been saving it for 9 days. "You didn't take dirt, Mrs. Kroll. You took the thing holding your subdivision together. You'll understand that in about a year." She laughed, a short, dismissive laugh, the kind reserved for men she assumed had nothing, and turned back to her booth. I walked away and didn't look back, but I'd already started building the file that would end her. Here's what most homeowners never think to ask when a board pushes a special assessment through. Where does the receipt trail go, and who's actually holding the invoice? I'd spent enough years cross-referencing state permit filings against actual excavation records to know that big money projects leave paper, even when people try hard to hide it. So over the following 6 weeks, between checking my own bog's water table with the same dip gauges I'd used my whole career, I started pulling threads. The county recorder's office gave me the first one for free, a $4,200 landscape beautification special assessment levied against all 240 lots in Tamarack Hollow, approved by board resolution in March, the same month the bulldozers showed up on my property. 240 times $4,200 comes to just over $1 million. For a rose garden and a koi pond that, as far as I could tell walking past it myself, consisted of 11 rose bushes, a paver circle, and a hole in the ground where the pond was supposed to go. I filed an open records request with the county for any commercial peat or topsoil hauling permits issued in April, since Minnesota requires a hauling manifest for any regulated wetland material moved off-site. That's where I found the second thread. 6 manifests, all issued to a company called Northland Ground Solutions LLC, listing the destination as 3 separate garden centers across 2 counties and the point of origin as a parcel number that matched exactly my grandfather's bog. Northland Ground Solutions LLC turned out to be registered 8 months earliest with the Minnesota Secretary of State, filed by a registered agent service out of Minneapolis with a single listed officer, V. Kroll. I sat at Henrik's roll-top desk for a long time after I found that. The wood under my hands was smooth from 90 years of use, and I remember running my thumb along a groove worn into the surface where 3 generations of Sorensen men had rested a coffee cup in almost exactly the same spot. My grandfather built that desk the same year the Depression hit this county hardest, and here I was using it to unravel a woman who'd stolen from 240 families to build herself a rose garden and, apparently, a shell company. Because the peat alone wasn't the whole story. Northland Ground Solutions had invoiced the HOA $340,000 for landscape material sourcing and installation services. Nearly all of the special assessment money funneled straight through a company that existed only on paper, whose sole asset appeared to be the peat she'd taken from land she didn't own. The rest of the $1 million assessment, near as I could reconstruct from board meeting minutes I pulled through a public records request under Minnesota's Common Interest Ownership Act, had gone to consulting fees, administrative services, and a management contract with a firm that, 3 phone calls later, I learned Vanessa Kroll's brother-in-law ran out of his garage. That was the moment the whole shape of it changed for me. This wasn't a bored HOA president bullying an old man over a swamp. This was $1.3 million moving through a subdivision's homeowner dues into a family's pockets, dressed up as landscaping. It was around then that I met Dorothy Hargrove. She lived 2 streets into Tamarack Hollow, in a small brick rambler with a wheelchair ramp her late husband had built himself before he passed. Dorothy was 78, a widow for 6 years, and her husband Frank had served 2 tours in Korea before coming home to spend 40 years driving a county snowplow. She kept his medals in a shadow box in the front hall, and she still flew a small American flag off her porch rail every morning, rain or not. I found her because her name kept appearing in the HOA violation log I'd pulled, 6 citations in 18 months, for things like unauthorized ramp structure, non-conforming exterior modification, and, unbelievably, failure to pay landscape beautification assessment, a $4,200 bill she couldn't afford on a fixed income, with late fees compounding monthly since March. I knocked on her door on a Thursday afternoon and found a small woman on oxygen, tubing looped over her ears, sitting in a recliner with a stack of HOA letters on the side table thick enough to choke a filing cabinet. She let me in because, she said later, I was the first person from outside that neighborhood who'd ever asked her a question instead of handing her a bill. They want to put a lien on my house, she told me, her voice thin but steady. Frank built that ramp with his own hands so I could get my chair out the door. They're calling it a violation. I sat with her for 2 hours that afternoon, and by the time I left, I had her signed permission to pull her HOA file, her assessment notices, and copies of 6 years of board meeting minutes she'd quietly kept in a shoebox, because some instinct, the same instinct maybe that kept my grandfather walking his bog barefoot every August, told her someday somebody would need to see them. I didn't know yet exactly how I was going to use what I had, but I knew, sitting in Dorothy Hargrove's living room with the smell of her oxygen machine humming and Frank's medals catching the afternoon light, that whatever came next wasn't just going to be about a bog anymore. Vanessa Kroll's first mistake had been assuming an old man with a swamp was harmless. Her second mistake was assuming Dorothy Hargrove was harmless too. 6 weeks after I sat in Dorothy's living room, the board mailed her a notice of intent to lien, threatening to place a $6,100 lien on her home, the original $4,200 assessment plus late fees, interest, and what the letter called administrative recovery costs. Dorothy called me that evening, her voice trembling in a way I hadn't heard before, oxygen hissing behind every other word. They said if I don't pay by the 15th, they'll start foreclosure proceedings, she said. Walter, Frank paid this house off in 1998. I don't have $6,000. I don't have $600. I told her not to pay a dime and not to sign anything, and I meant it. But I also felt something shift in my chest that night. The particular kind of anger that doesn't shout, just settles in and gets patient. I'd spent 36 years watching bureaucracies grind people down through paperwork instead of force, because paperwork doesn't leave bruises anybody can see. Vanessa Kroll was about to take an 80-year-old widow's paid-off house over a rose garden assessment, and she was going to do it with a clipboard and a straight face. That was the moment I stopped only defending my own bog and started building a case for both of us. The lien notice gave me something valuable though, a filing deadline, which meant a public county hearing date, which meant Vanessa Kroll would have to show up somewhere official, on the record, in front of people who weren't on her payroll. I started making calls. I'd worked with the county's Board of Water and Soil Resources for over 3 decades, and I still had a former colleague there, a woman named Renata Ibarra, who'd taken over wetland enforcement in my old district. I walked her through everything: the manifests, the parcel numbers, the shell company, the assessment records Dorothy had kept in her shoebox for 6 years without ever knowing why. Renata went quiet on the phone for a long moment. "Walter," she finally said, "you're describing an unpermitted wetland excavation on a protected peatland resource, times roughly 240 truckloads, which under 103G.245 carries civil penalties up to $10,000 per day of violation. And that's before we even get into what the county attorney does with the assessment fraud." "I know," I said. "I want it done right, documented, public. I don't want a fine that disappears into a settlement nobody reads about." She agreed to open a formal state investigation, which meant an inspector would need to visit the site, measure the excavation depth against baseline soil surveys, and issue findings that would become public record. I gave her my father's 1969 hydrology map and 11 years of my own water table logs as baseline data, proof of exactly how deep and saturated that peat had been before Vanessa Kroll's crew ever touched it. While the state investigation moved through channels I couldn't control, I focused on something I could: Dorothy's lien hearing, and making sure Vanessa Kroll walked into it with cameras rolling. I called a reporter I'd known for years, a woman named Priya Chandrasekhar, who covered county government for the regional paper and had done a series on HOA overreach the previous year. I didn't tell her everything yet. I told her enough: a widowed veteran's wife facing foreclosure over a landscaping fee, an HOA president running a shell company, a state wetland investigation already underway, to get her interested enough to show up. 2 days before Dorothy's hearing, Vanessa Kroll made the mistake that sealed everything. Dorothy's ramp, the one Frank built by hand in 2015, sturdy cedar with a non-slip surface he'd sanded himself over a summer, had been cited in that stack of violation letters as a non-conforming exterior modification. The HOA's remedy, buried in fine print nobody reads until it's aimed at them, was that the association reserved the right to remove non-conforming structures itself and bill the homeowner for the cost. At 7:40 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before the hearing, a maintenance crew hired by the HOA showed up at Dorothy's house with a truck and a set of bolt cutters and a battery-powered circular saw. Dorothy called me before she called anyone else, her voice cracking through the oxygen hiss. "They're outside, Walter. They're cutting Frank's ramp." I told her to stay inside, to lock her door, and I drove the 11 minutes to her house faster than I've driven anywhere in 20 years. When I pulled up, 2 men in polo shirts with a Northland Grounds Solutions logo stitched over the pocket, the same shell company, I noted, that had hauled off my grandfather's peat, were already prying up the ramp's support posts with a crowbar, while Vanessa Kroll stood on the sidewalk in a cream blazer, clipboard under her arm, directing them like she was overseeing a landscaping install instead of tearing a disabled widow's access ramp off her own front porch. I didn't get out of my truck right away. I got out my phone first. "Mrs. Kroll," I called out, walking up with the camera already recording. "Do you have a permit for structural removal on private residential property?" She turned, and for a half second I watched something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe irritation, before the professional mask slid back into place. "This is an HOA-authorized remediation of a non-conforming structure, Mr. Sorensen. It's all in the covenants." "She's disabled," I said. "That ramp is medical access. You're required under the Fair Housing Act to provide reasonable accommodation for disability-related modifications. You can't remove it." We sent 3 notices. You sent 3 notices about aesthetics, not about tearing an access ramp off a widow's house before a scheduled foreclosure hearing. I kept the phone up, kept my voice level, the way I'd learned to testify in front of hostile counsel decades ago. Flat, factual, unhurried. I'd stop your crew right now if I were you. She didn't stop them. That was the thing about Vanessa Kroll. She'd never once, in 6 years running that board, been told no by anyone who could actually make it stick. And she wasn't going to start believing it from a man in work boots standing on a sidewalk. She gave a small nod to the crew, and the saw whined back to life, and I watched, camera steady, as they finished cutting through the last support post and the ramp came down in pieces onto Dorothy's lawn. Dorothy stood in her doorway the whole time, oxygen tank on its little cart beside her, one hand gripping the frame, watching 80 years of dignity get sawed apart in under 15 minutes. She didn't cry, she just watched, the way I imagined she'd watched Frank's coffin lowered 6 years earlier. Quiet, upright, absorbing something she couldn't undo. I had 4 minutes and 12 seconds of clean video. Vanessa Kroll's face, clearly identifiable, standing beside a company logo that traced straight back to her own shell corporation, directing the destruction of a federally protected disability accommodation 3 days before a lien hearing on the same homeowner. I sent the footage to Renata that afternoon and to Priya an hour after that, and I filed a formal complaint with the county's Fair Housing Office before dinner. That night, I sat at Henrik's desk again, and instead of anger, I felt something colder and more useful settle in. The same feeling I used to get in the field, right before I confirmed a saturation reading that was about to shut down somebody's illegal drainage operation. Certainty. I drafted 3 things that night. First, a formal notice to the Tamarack Hollow HOA board, delivered by certified mail, revoking any informal access easement they believed they held across my property line. Access they'd been using, technically illegally, for the peat removal trucks to reach the county road. Second, a request to the county for a public hearing date on the wetland violation to run concurrently with Dorothy's lien case, so both matters would land in front of the same judge on the same afternoon. Third, and this was the part I didn't tell anyone yet, not even Renata, a letter to the county's Water and Soil Board formally requesting recognition of my bog as an actively managed wetland mitigation site, citing 11 years of water table restoration data I'd been quietly recording since 2013, long before any of this started. I wasn't building a lawsuit anymore. I was building a legal wall around every option Vanessa Kroll had left, and I wanted every brick of it dated, notarized, and witnessed before she even understood the shape of what was closing in on her. The hearing was set for the second Thursday in September, 2 p.m. in the County Administration Building, and by the time Vanessa Kroll walked into that room, she had no idea it had already become 2 hearings, 3 agencies, and 1 very patient old man's evidence file merged into a single afternoon. I sat near the back with Renata Ibarra on one side and Priya Chandrasekhar, notepad open, on the other. Dorothy Hargrove sat in the front row in her wheelchair. She'd needed it since the ramp came down, since climbing her own porch steps without it had become impossible, with her son beside her, who'd flown in from Arizona the moment I called him. County Sheriff's Deputy Raymond Okafor stood near the exit, there at Renata's request, because state wetland violations above a certain penalty threshold require law enforcement presence at the finding, and because Priya's paper had, by then, run a front-page story with a still frame from my video. Vanessa Kroll, clipboard in hand, directing the removal of a disabled veteran's widow's access ramp. Vanessa arrived 11 minutes late in a navy suit instead of her usual cream blazer, no clipboard this time, flanked by an attorney who looked like he already regretted taking the call. She sat at the respondent's table and didn't look at Dorothy once. The county attorney opened with the wetland violation. Renata's office had completed its formal soil survey 2 weeks earlier, comparing excavation depth against my father's 1969 baseline map and my own 11 years of water table logs. The findings were stark, projected on a screen at the front of the room. 3 feet of peat removed across 11 acres, a 61% reduction in localized water retention capacity, groundwater seepage into the surrounding aquifer down by nearly half since April. 261 documented truckloads, cross-referenced against hauling manifests naming Northland Ground Solutions LLC as the carrier and Vanessa Kroll as its sole listed officer. Under Minnesota Statute 103G.245, the county attorney said, unpermitted excavation of a protected wetland resource carries civil penalties of up to $10,000 per day of violation. Given the duration of removal activity documented here, the state is seeking penalties in excess of $200,000, in addition to mandatory restoration costs. Vanessa's attorney tried to argue the parcel's wetland status hadn't been formally established before the excavation. That's when I stood up, at the county attorney's invitation, and presented the second piece of paper Vanessa Kroll had never once bothered to ask about. My family's parcel, I said, was registered as an actively monitored wetlands mitigation site with the Board of Water and Soil Resources in 2013, under a voluntary conservation easement I filed after 11 years of independent hydrology data collection. That designation was on public record, searchable by any developer or HOA board conducting due diligence before initiating landscaping work adjacent to a private parcel. I laid my father's 1969 map and my own logs on the table. Nobody asked. If they had, I would have told them exactly what would happen to the soil underneath 240 homes once that peat came out. That was the Tizer coming true, and I watched it land on her face in real time. Not fear yet, just the first flicker of arithmetic. The realization that the swamp she'd dismissed at a garden expo had been quietly wired into permanent legal protection for over a decade before she ever touched it. Then came the financial testimony, and this was where Priya's reporting and Renata's records converged into something Vanessa's attorney couldn't soften. A forensic accountant retained by the county walked the room through the money. $4,200 per household, 240 households, $1,008,000 collected under the Landscape Beautification Special Assessment. Of that, $340,000 had moved directly to Northland Ground Solutions LLC, Vanessa's shell company, for peat that had, in fact, cost her nothing since it had been stolen off my land. Another $290,000 had gone to a management consulting contract awarded to a company operated by her brother-in-law, work that consisted, per the accountant's investigation, of 11 site visits and no verifiable deliverables. Combined with two similar assessments run in prior years, a security enhancement fee and a clubhouse renovation levy, the accountant's total estimate came to $1.3 million diverted through shell arrangements over 3 years. This is theft by swindle under Minnesota Statute 609.52, the county attorney said, compounded by wire fraud given the electronic transfer of association dues into personal accounts. Deputy Okafor stepped forward at that point, and the room went very still. He read Vanessa Kroll her rights in the same flat procedural voice you'd use to read a weather report, and I watched Priya's camera flash catch the exact moment the handcuffs closed. Vanessa's navy suit, her attorney half standing in useless protest, and behind her, projected still on the screen, my father's 1969 hydrology map, the one document that had outlasted every lie she'd built on top of it. Dorothy's lien hearing, folded into the same afternoon by the judge's order, took 11 minutes. With the fraud findings on record and the fair housing violation from the ramp destruction already substantiated by my video, the judge didn't just dismiss the $6,100 lien, she ordered the HOA's remaining board members, none of whom had been criminally charged but all of whom had signed off on the assessment, to personally fund Dorothy's ramp reconstruction within 30 days, plus $2,000 in damages for pain and inconvenience. Vanessa Kroll was convicted 4 months later. The court ordered $84,000 in direct restitution, tied specifically to the diverted management and consulting fees the prosecution could trace to her personal accounts, on top of a separate $220,000 civil penalty to the state for the wetland violation, and a court order requiring full restoration of the excavated bog to the greatest extent hydrologically possible at HOA expense. She served 14 months in the county correctional facility and lost her real estate license permanently. Her brother-in-law, facing his own charges for the fraudulent consulting contract, agreed to a plea deal, returning $60,000 and testifying against her. Northland Ground Solutions LLC was dissolved by court order, its remaining assets, mostly unpaid invoices, seized to partially offset the restoration costs. The rest of the board, 6 people who'd approved every assessment without ever asking where the money went, weren't criminally charged, but a class action filed by furious homeowners eventually forced them to personally repay $180,000 combined into a homeowner relief fund, and every one of them resigned within the year. And the homes, the ones Vanessa had built her rose garden empire beside, started cracking exactly on the timeline I'd known they would. The first foundation split appeared in November, 14 months after the excavation, a hairline fracture through a garage slab 3 doors down from where the koi pond was supposed to go. By the following spring, 19 homes had documented structural settling, foundations sinking unevenly as the ground beneath them, no longer buffered by a saturated peat cushion, dried and shifted with every season's freeze and thaw. The HOA's insurance carrier fought every claim, citing pre-existing soil conditions, and homeowners who'd paid $4,200 for a rose garden ended up paying tens of thousands more just to keep their houses level. That's when the new board, Dorothy Hargrove among them, elected board president that spring in a landslide, her name written in by neighbours who'd watched her ramp get torn apart on the local news, came to my door. I remember the morning clearly because it was raining, the kind of steady grey rain that used to make my grandfather smile. And Dorothy sat in her wheelchair on my porch with 2 other board members standing awkwardly behind her, asking me, formally, on behalf of Tamarack Hollow Estate, whether I would consider allowing them to reflood the low ground, restore the water table, save what was left of their foundations. I brought out the folder from Henrik's roll-top desk, the same one I'd been adding to for 11 years, and set the conservation easement on the porch table between us. The ink faded slightly, but the county seal still sharp. This parcel, I said, has been under permanent state conservation protection since 2013. It cannot be developed, drained, or altered without my consent as the registered steward, and mine alone. The answer is no. Not because I want your houses to sink, because that bog isn't a resource for you to manage when it's convenient. It's not for sale, and it's not for borrowing. And I built 11 years of legal protection specifically so nobody could ever again decide it was theirs to take. Dorothy didn't ask again. She understood better than anyone in that neighborhood what it meant to lose something because someone with a clipboard decided it was expendable. I walk the bog most mornings still, same as Henrik did, checking the give underfoot, listening to the tamaracks. The duck blind's still standing. The smell of peat and cold water still catches me somewhere old and steady in my chest every single time. If there's a lesson in all this, it's a short one. Read the documents before you sign them. Ask who actually owns the ground you're standing on before you decide it's worthless. And understand that quiet men who spent 30 years measuring water tables for a living tend to know exactly how long it takes for the truth to rise back to the surface. Vanessa Kroll thought a swamp had no vote. She learned in a courtroom, in handcuffs, in front of the whole county, that some ground remembers everything done to it, and eventually it settles the score itself. Dorothy still flies Frank's flag every morning off her rebuilt ramp. And somewhere in my grandfather's desk there's a new folder started, because 2 counties over, a developer's already asking questions about a stretch of wetland along the river that used to belong to a man named Pedersen. And I've got a feeling this isn't the last time I'll need 11 years of patience and a hydrology map nobody bothered to read. I sat back down at Henrik's desk that night after Dorothy and her board members had gone home in the rain, and I let myself think about the whole arc of it for the first time since April. I thought about the sound those excavators made that first morning, that grinding, tearing sound of machinery pulling something ancient out of the ground like it was nothing. I thought about Vanessa Kroll's laugh at the garden expo, dismissive, certain, the laugh of a woman who'd never once in her life been told no by anyone who could make it stick. I thought about the look on her face in that courtroom when Deputy Okafor read her rights, how her attorney's mouth had opened and then just stayed open like he couldn't find the next sentence anywhere in his files. I thought too about the smaller moments nobody puts in a courtroom transcript. The way Dorothy's son had gripped the back of her wheelchair during the hearing, knuckles white, jaw tight, a grown man in his 50s who'd flown 1,400 miles because someone tried to take his mother's dignity over a landscaping fee. The way Priya had lowered her camera for just a second when the cuffs went on, not out of mercy, but because even she seemed to need a breath before she kept documenting it. The neighbours, once the story broke, reacted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. A woman named Carol Whitfield, who lived 3 houses down from Dorothy and had voted for every one of Vanessa's assessments without asking a single question, showed up at my property line about a week after the hearing with a casserole dish of all things, standing awkwardly at the fence where the bulldozers had once idled. "I didn't know," she told me. "I want you to understand that. I signed the assessment form because everyone else did. I never looked at where the money went." "Most people don't," I said. "That's not an accusation, it's just true. That's how these things get away with what they get away with." She nodded slowly, looking past me at the low ground, at the tamarack starting to show colour even that early in the season. "Is it going to come back? The bog, I mean."
"Fully. Parts of it," I said. "Peat doesn't regrow in a season, or a decade, sometimes not in a lifetime. What we saved was the water table underneath it, the part that was actually holding your neighbourhood's foundation steady. The rest just needs time, nobody's going to rush." She left the casserole dish anyway, and I ate from it for 3 days, and I thought that was maybe the strangest form of restitution in this whole ordeal. A woman who'd never wronged me directly, apologising with a hot dish for a wrong she hadn't known she was part of. Renata called a month later to tell me the state was using the Tamarack Hollow case as a training example for new wetland enforcement officers. My 11 years of water table logs held up as a model of exactly the kind of documentation that makes an unbeatable case. I told her I hadn't kept those records to win anything. I'd kept them because Henrik taught me that some ground needs a witness, whether anybody ever asks to see the notes or not. I still hadn't told anyone about the letter from Pettersson's grandson, folded up in my coat pocket since the week before, asking whether I'd be willing to look at a parcel 2 counties over before a developer's survey crew got there first.